The modern Doom games are probably some of the best modern action titles to ever be released, among other juggernauts like Devil May Cry 5 or most FromSoft games. The original series in the 90s was one of the pioneers of the first-person shooter genre, along with Wolfenstein 3D, which were both developed by id Software. They're also partially the reason why the SRB exists, so that's cool. The thing is that while Doom 1, 2, and 3 were fun, the third game seemed to have been the most divisive, and with that the series was put on pause for quite some time. Around the late 2000s to early 2010s, id tried to make Doom 4, but the prototype wasn't very good, at least by their standards. It didn't look bad per se, but considering all the first-person shooters that came out around this time, it definitely looked like a cynical and corporate entry that the devs weren't very proud of. They scrapped it because they didn't want it what's essentially another Call of Duty reskin. It makes sense, because id Software realized that they basically pioneered this genre, and didn't want their next game to be a non-innovative clone of other games at the time that they already inspired in the first place. So with Doom 4 cancelled, they started from scratch and rebooted the series, until this was retconned in Eternal, and made a game simply called Doom, which came out in the summer of 2016. It was released to mass acclaim, because it was a breath of fresh air for the first-person shooter genre, especially for how their single-player campaigns played out. Instead of walking slowly to an objective and then monotonously killing the AI-controlled enemies by peeking out and ducking behind cover, you were instead encouraged to be more aggressive and careful at the same time. Doom 2016 did have some issues, like it becoming almost too easy as soon as the game went on, and having a pretty underwhelming final boss, but it was a game that the FPS genre needed at the time, and it still holds up really well today. After they saw the success of Doom 2016, they went on to make the inevitable sequel that was already set up by the end of the game. It was announced in 2018 and was called Doom Eternal, slated for a 2019 release date, but then got delayed to spring of 2020. When it did come out when everyone thought the world would end, many had claimed it was even bigger and better than 2016, which I would agree with. For Eternal, it seemed to have changed a lot from 2016, which I think made it better. The ammo was lessened so that you could focus more on resource management and constant weapon switching. The combat was more vertical, and they even added stuff like platforming into the mix. Eternal is one of my favorite games of all time, and I couldn't imagine any game topping it. Which is why when Bethesda announced Doom: The Dark Ages, I wasn't exactly skeptical, but I already knew from the first trailer that while it would be still fun, it wouldn't be as good as Eternal. I had the feeling that even with the hype that others thought what I thought, because most agreed that Eternal was pretty much damn near perfect as far as fast-paced action shooters are concerned. Eternal was literally so good that it rebirthed this genre of shooters, which catalyzed a bunch of indie games that were very much inspired by it. I didn't really account for Dark Ages doing the same thing, but I guess others did. All this rambling is to say that while there are things to be criticized about this game, Doom: The Dark Ages is still pretty great. Will it be as replayable as Eternal? Probably not. But that doesn't change the fact that it's another really fun, unpretentious action shooter that doesn't get bogged down by the usual plagues of modern AAA games, that usually have an abundance of nonsensical live service elements and loads of meaningless story stuff that hampers gameplay. It may be a different game, but it's still Doom. So because this is probably the least important part of the game, I'll tackle the story first, but it's not like anyone's gonna give a shit about this one. It did say that they wanted a more focused story after being loaded with criticisms of Eternal's narrative. I'm curious as to what pushed them to do this and what criticisms they even paid attention to, because I think this plot has almost the exact same problems as Eternal, especially in how absolutely incomprehensible it all is. I barely understand the actual story of this game, but to summarize it, Doom: The Dark Ages takes place somewhere between Doom 64 and Doom 3. In this prequel, the Doom Slayer's task was protecting this castle of King Novik from the forces of hell as it's overrun by demons. With all that in mind, Demon Prince Azrak and this witch lady want to find this MacGuffin called the Heart of Argent, which I have no other reason to care about other than it's powerful, and could also help the witch learn about some god or something. But then they realize that it's actually in one of the Sentinel soldiers at the castle named Thera, so they abduct her and try to extract energy from her, but she doesn't know that she has this power, so they have to force her to have it? I don't know. And with that summary, it's the impetus to what's basically an M-rated Save the Princess story. With that, you save her, and then you learn that Azrak is possibly jealous of the Slayer's mental chokehold on the forces of hell, which I guess in his mind prevents him from ruling as king, so he wants to kill the Slayer. I really don't care about any of these motives or feelings, but it exists to create cool moments, I guess. And I guess that's the common sentiment I maintain throughout the runtime. Sure, I don't expect a deep story from Doom, but it was honestly really hard to tell what was broadly going on with the narrative, even if it was was easier to follow in comparison to Eternal, I would still have most of the same issues with it not being interesting. It's gonna feel really weird to say this, but despite not being very good as far as story goes, I think 2016 has probably the best of these new games, mostly because it used a lot more environmental storytelling, but it never felt like you had to read hundreds of codex entries just to get the plot. It wasn't a good story, but it was a comprehensible one. You know, these new Doom games' approach to storytelling reminds me a hell of a lot of the new Hitman series, which also started in 2016. While there are cutscenes and mission briefings, the actual motives or feelings of the characters that aren't Agent 47 or Birdwood are often completely undefined, and sometimes the cutscenes just feel like they're just there for the sake of it. I only really started to at least kind of understand the plot spoilers for Hitman 3, when Burnwood betrays 47, but it's not like I cared all that much. The only way you'd understand the plots of any of these games is having read the several codices and having been a lore master of the series. Doom is a lot like that, but I would argue it's slightly better because it at least makes up for it with the cool over-the-top spectacle that the series is known for. It doesn't change the fact that the story is just not very good and the characters are pretty dull. I think the Slayer being a mostly mute protagonist that doesn't need to speak every feeling still works, but the others are just boring. The villains especially are just bland, even if you take out their motivations. There really isn't a whole lot to say about the story because, like Eternal, it's incredibly confusing, yet also not that narratively engaging. I'm trying my best to pad out this segment, but there's really nothing to mention here. One may even ask, why the hell are you covering this? It's Doom, just skip the cutscenes. No. If the developers spend a shit ton of time animating the cutscenes and hiring actors to bring these characters to life, I'm going to appreciate that by watching them. Besides, watching cutscenes actually helps me understand what I'm doing in games, which sounds weird, but someone in the comments please mention if you have the same thought process as me, so I can feel validated. Thank you. Overall, the story isn't horrible or anything, but it's not very good either, which is somewhat expected for the Doom games. It's not that deep, nor does it challenge the players, but it doesn't have to be in this specific case. It's a fast-paced action shooter that should be focused on specifically that, even if it would be nice to have a better plot. The story makes up for the lack of depth with the insane amount of hype, which hype should exist in an action game like this. It's kinda like those modern anime with very thin plots and characters, but cool fight scenes. There's nothing spectacular about its story, but it's entertaining, I guess. Anyway, let's talk about the part that people are actually talking about. The presentation. I promise we'll get to gameplay soon. Despite what some people are inclined to believe, presentation is a pretty important part of a Doom game, as much as any other game ever. It have done a pretty good job at both making a really well-crafted and textured world, while also having solid art direction. Despite the game's fast-paced combat, it always makes sure to make these games as detailed as humanly possible. In fact, they do it so much that I kind of feel bad having to quickly zoom through all of it by participating in combat. This game is no different, as you'll literally see amazing skyboxes and sometimes even mechs and titans clashing just like in Eternal. The unique art styles between games are also very spot on too, especially the hell levels. 2016 went for a grungier style that wasn't too photorealistic, but it was pretty dark and moody, while Eternal went for a more bouncy and arcadey direction, and I personally didn't like it as much as 2016's, but I still think the game looked good, so that didn't really matter to me. Dark Age's Middle Ages aesthetic feels like a mix of the best parts of both art styles, strangely. It's not boringly realistic, but it's also not too cartoony either. I will say that the character designs are a bit interesting to me though. The Slayer looks more like a Space Marine, the humans look very Gears of War, the Makers look very Halo, but not like the old Halo, but more like Halo 4 and 5 maybe. And then the demons look really Diablo and World of Warcraft inspired. You know, none of this looks bad obviously, and it's not a criticism at all, but it is noticeable and I can understand someone being a little bothered by it, even if it doesn't bother me too much. The other aspect of the presentation in Doom isn't just art direction or graphics, but it's also the music, which is a little disappointing here. Now, to understand why, we have to explain how the composer for the other games, Mick Gordon, had to leave id Software and Bethesda because they weren't compensating him well enough for his work on both games. So for this game, they hired a music group called Finishing Move, and I don't think they even touched Mick's compositions. Mick had played a big role in how good and absolutely iconic the music was in those other games, because there was a certain twang that this new game doesn't quite have. The music here isn't even bad, it's actually quite good, but it's just not the same, man. I won't say it sounds like it's AI generated, like some bad faith critics regurgitate, but it does sound very stock in comparison. Part of what I think made Doom 2016 and Eternal's soundtrack so memorable is that they felt uniquely like Doom. I think the problem with Dark Age's soundtrack is that you can literally put this music in almost any other action game, and you wouldn't even know it was from Dark Ages. Now, this sounds like a nebulous praise to give the other games to bring this one down, but I genuinely cannot remember a single track from Doom Dark Ages, and I've tried listening to it, and it just doesn't hit the same way as Eternal in 2016. I get it. Mick Gordon left some pretty big shoes to fill for finishing move here, and his work was so distinct that it's hard to replicate or top. The problem is that because of that standard, this new soundtrack just feels like a massive downgrade. Again, it's pretty good on its own, but the music often fades into the background amongst all the chaos instead of being the cherry on top of it like it was in the other games. I actually feel really bad for finishing move, because the expectations are clearly high when you're basically standing in for someone as good as Mick. I feel like it was just a major disappointment despite sounding pretty good for what it was. However, I do also think that it's okay that Mick Gordon isn't back. Considering that they didn't get to pay him, I think it's fine that he left. But with all that said, the presentation of the game is still great, and while the music isn't the best in the series, at least I didn't hate it, I guess. And with that out of the way, we can finally move on to the part we've been waiting for. For real this time. So the best and most controversial part of this game is shockingly the gameplay, funnily enough. People are talking about how they're either over the moon about the move mechanics and saying that every criticism is invalid, while others are saying that it's too different and doesn't feel like Doom. What do I, a random near 20-year-old dipshit hack on the internet, think? Well, I'm glad the voices in my head ask. I won't be a fence-sitting bitch and say that I'm in the middle, nor would I say I 100% agree with these. So instead, I'll say that they're both wrong, to a degree. Now, this might make me sound like a bratty child who bashes anyone who doesn't agree with me word for word, but hear me out on this one for a bit. There's a lot to unpack here with people's opinions on the gameplay of Dark Ages. I don't think anyone is invalid for liking this game, or even saying it's their new favorite of the series and with this new style of gameplay. However, this isn't to say that the other side who was disappointment isn't valid either, and feeling like the gameplay was seemingly too different, or just didn't vibe with them the same way it did for people who think the game is damn near perfect. I think both sides have some good points as to why they don't like certain parts of the game, but I also think that sometimes they can overblow both their praises and criticisms. With all that said, core gameplay is still amazing and satisfying as usual for these new games. Something I really appreciate about all three of these rebooted games, and the Doom series as a whole, is how different they handle each game's core gameplay loop while retaining the series' identity first and foremost. They all basically use the same weapons as the first game to an extent, but the format is different enough each time because it is very focused on making sure each game is good, not just by topping themselves each time, but more so by doing something else. They de-emphasize the faster pace of Eternal for something slightly more strafey and laid back akin to 2016. But unlike 2016, it strives to be more of a 3D bullet hell like the original Doom, and has more mechanical complexities. I'll use examples of something the naysayers dislike first, the game being centered around parrying with the shield. Now I'll be honest and say that I thought this idea was cool, even if unconventional for the Doom series. Doom is a series that focuses on aggression more than defense and staying behind cover, so a shield with the option to parry doesn't 100% detract from this idea. In fact, I think it encourages your aggression more than just, say, staying behind a wall Gears of War style. The parrying feels satisfying and its timing can be adjusted just like other aspects of difficulty in the game. I personally put the parry timing on medium and it was basically perfect for me. It wasn't too hard to pull off as the timing is pretty generous, but it also wasn't hilariously easy either. Despite the game being considerably easier than Eternal, I think it was just the right amount of that challenging but fair feeling that id was going for in that game. A lot of people don't care for the parry because it doesn't feel like Doom, but I would say yes and no to that. It may be different and not what the other games encourage, but at the same time I do think that it requires the same amount of fast thinking, coordination, and twitchy reflexes that the other games targeted. Plus it helps that the shield has a stamina bar to make sure you don't abuse it, since there are projectiles that you can avoid by just strafe dodging. Parrying is a core part of the combat loop in Doom the Dark Ages, so if you're not parrying, you're basically dead. The other new part of the Doom gameplay loop that people are a bit divided on are the melee weapons. Now, the new Doom games have honestly never gotten this part right in my opinion. In 2016 it was functional, but it was hilariously spammable on smaller demons, and it made the entire game a bit too easy at times, especially if you were on low health. Eternal decides to tweak this by basically making it do nothing at all when you use it. They do introduce the blood punch thing, but the blood punch honestly makes the basic melee feel completely pointless because it quite literally doesn't do anything. I think Dark Ages handles the melee mechanics the best of these new games, even if the two new melee weapons are different. I like that these melee attacks are incredibly strong and have a meter to charge like the blood punch, but they make it so that you can't melee if you use up all of the charges. It seems restricting, but I think it helps in this case because it doesn't make the melee button feel as useless in combat as it did in Eternal. You start off with just your fist for the first few missions, and then a flail after those missions. If charged, you can hit any enemy with this attack and you can replenish your ammo afterwards. and when the enemy is at low enough health, you can get health back. It's basically like an alternative to the chainsaw, and once you unlock the mace, you do even more damage and get even more ammo in return with the trade-off of fewer charges. Despite the weapon switching mechanics being somewhat nerfed, I do think that these melee attack charges do help in partially retaining that resource management loop from Eternal to some degree, even if it's not as challenging or complex. I will say that one thing that this new melee structure does diminish somewhat is the ability to glory kill the demon. I say somewhat because you can't kill the smaller demons, but you can technically glory kill the bigger demons like the Mancubus or the Pinky. The main catch is that you have to jump at a certain angle, facing 100% right in front of them, or 100% behind them. You can't even do it from the sides, which feels like a bit of an arbitrary decision. However, you can also tell that they quite majorly toned down the gore effects for the few glory kill reminiscent executions that do exist. While the executions are still fairly brutal compared to a lot of games on the market, I do think that compared to 2016 and especially Eternal, these are more than just a bit neutered. I think I know exactly why that is the case though. With the graphics engine upgrading from id Tech 7 to id Tech 8, the team probably wanted to focus on improving certain details when taking down the demons. You can see this is very apparent when you shoot the demons, as the chunks of flesh come off as soon as you shoot them with whatever weapon of your choice. This chunk rendering is probably insanely hardware intensive, which is important because this game is running on home consoles still, and at 60 FPS. Adding blood would probably make the frame rate chug way more, which I guess I can live with because the game ran pretty well for me. I also suspect that the considerable lack of gore in comparison to the other games is a Microsoft decision, considering that they bought Bethesda when this game was in development. As I played, I started to remember the changes Halo and Gears of War made to the gore effects and enemy types when their fourth entries were worked on by Microsoft's proprietary studios after Bungie and Epic Games left to do their own stuff. It got so bad for Halo that it's now a T-rated series for some reason, despite the series being older than a lot of people who were teenagers by the time Halo 5 came out. I don't think that the Doom changes are nearly as egregious as Halo and Gears, where it's basically just censorship, but it feels familiarly strange. Overall, the core combat of Doom Dark Ages is excellent, and while I do understand the criticisms with it, I also think that there's a lot of merit to this combat system. However, while I do think that parrying in slightly less difficult but still engaging combat is a good thing, I also feel like there was a bit of overcorrecting in some aspects of the combat. For one, you can't switch weapons anymore without this weird second-long delay for some reason. I do think that it's fine that the game doesn't encourage rapid on-the-fly weapon swapping like Eternal did, but I do think that it should have still kept weapon switching for the sake of combo potential and for those who want to make professional skill videos or something. I do think that gunplay is still pretty fun and satisfying, but it does feel, again, overcorrected with some aspects from the other games, and weapon switching is the main one. There are also a few things I just don't like about the gameplay at all, and that has to do more with things surrounding the combat than the combat itself. The level design is probably the biggest downgrade from both Eternal and 2016, if I'm being honest. I think the linear areas are fine and more fun, but then you have these open areas that aren't as much fun to play around in. See, in the other games it felt like you were using every bit of the terrain in the combat to your advantage in some way. Despite being pretty linear, the levels were still designed with complexity of combat in mind. Eternal doubly so with the amount of poles you can swing off of and less smooth topography in both that and 2016. Even something as simple as jumping to another platform and avoiding the electric floor in 2016 was more fun and dynamic than what's here. Dark Ages has these open combat arenas that are dull because they just feel incredibly boring to traverse through, despite the fact that the combat is still really fun. The open areas are really flat and simplistic, and they don't really seem to have the environmental variety that the last few games did. Sure, they'll put in an ammo crate or a pickup or an explosive barrel in a random place, but that's pretty much it. It's still fun to fight enemies in there, but it's so dull to traverse the actual grounds because there's no interesting or meaningful way to interact with the level design. There's also this random issue with these weird, specific spongy enemies that have health and armor upgrades. No, I'm not talking about the leaders where you have to kill every big enemy within the vicinity to do damage to them. I'm talking about the ones where you can isolate them in a room and take so much damage for literally no reason. It takes several shots and melees just to kill these guys. Thankfully, they ended up being secondary objective by about the 5th mission or so, but they still suck and take way too long to kill, and it's not fun at all. I feel like another way of possibly alleviating this is maybe having special enemies like the Marauders or something. I know people don't like that, but hey, I don't care. The Marauders were a good enemy type. People just complained in the first week of the game because they wanted to get good at the game immediately. Another major thing that people seem to be a bit mixed on are the Dragon and Atlan combat segments. Some people hate it because it's not like Doom, once again, and some people love them because of the sheer hype and spectacle. I think both of these are pretty valid to some degree. but I don't think either of these make these sections good or bad. I sit right in the middle as far as this discourse goes, to be honest. The Atlan is probably the better of the two in my opinion, but that's more so because of Mission 21 where they gave it a decent boss. The mechanics are more melee focused for the most part, until close to the end of the level where they give you a more ranged weapon. Each punch feels satisfying as you take on these gargantuan titanic creatures, and the scale is massive. The segments where you ride Surat are a lot different, as not only are you in the air, but ranged combat is the primary method of taking down enemies with no melee. You usually shoot at ships and tentacles, but that's about it. You fire normal bullets out of the turrets, and if you perfect dodge the enemy's attack, you start to fire enhanced rounds. The timings are pretty easy, even if I fumbled with the directions, I had to dodge it first, but you know what, it's fine, it takes some level of skill, I guess. I think they are a cool spectacle, just for the fact that the Slayer rides a cybernetically enhanced dragon and pilots a mech, but that's about it. I won't say it doesn't feel like Doom, because that's a pretty nebulous criticism, but I will say it does sort of go against the mantra of these games, which is remaining in control of the fight at all times. Sure, you had glory kills, which were technically scripted animations, but at the same time, you didn't have to do them, and you could just kill an enemy without having to perform a glory kill. In 2016 in Eternal, you pretty much never let go of the controller, or stood completely still during a fight until it was over. Especially in the case of Eternal, this encouraged the player to constantly keep moving and remain in control of every part of combat without resorting to a quick time event or a super scripted Xbox 360 shooter set piece moment. It's what made Doom 2016 and Eternal far different from other shooters on the market at that time, because they encouraged aggression, but specifically in a way where you are in control and aren't asked to stand still and auto-target the enemies. There was still some type of prompting, but it was never that restrictive, mostly being only in regards to teaching you what weapons you could use to dispatch certain enemies quickly. The funny thing about all this talk about this entire design philosophy that Hugo Martin and his team used when making these other games is that it's still in Dark Ages for the core combat. The thing is that the gameplay design logic is exclusively used in the core combat segments of this game, which is fine, I guess. It's basically 90% of what you do, but these new Doom games are not known to just take a break from this idea while you're still in combat. The point is that the dragon segments do not follow this rule at all for the most part, and end up feeling quite stale. I like that they still require some form of skill and some control, but they're so insultingly easy and unengaging that they require significantly less effort than most of the combat. Now with that in mind, I don't think that segments like these would really need a high level of skill or control in other games, but this is Doom. I don't think it inherently doesn't feel like Doom conceptually, but in the mechanical context of this game, they do seem a bit like an abrupt interruption to the more engaging ground combat. These bits feel like a segment out of the Xbox 360 era COD or Gears of War games or something, and while I do like those games, I feel like Dark Ages could have made them feel a bit more similar to ground combat in some ways, instead of the more Simon Says approach here. I liked the Atlan at first when it was introduced, but as soon as I started putting the mechanics into practice and getting used to them, it became pretty perfunctory really quickly. You don't do much except punch, dodge, and use a finishing blow, and you have to use the finishing blow. It can be fun, especially with the last mech segment where you get a boss fight with a Cthulhu monster, but it's not that engaging in most mech combat. Sometimes they'll introduce shooting, but it's honestly less engaging because the shooting is even easier to do. Same thing applies to the segments where you ride the dragon, as it does the Atlan segments. This time it's mostly focused on shooting, and I'd say that for me, it took a while to get adjusted to the dodging directions. That was more so because of the fact that the patterns were a lot more to get used to in comparison to the Atlan segments. Yet, once I became completely accustomed to the mechanics and dodge timings with the Atlan and dragon by the end of the first segment, my brain just sort of went into autopilot with each subsequent encounter. Look, I'm not saying that these segments are a bit subpar because they aren't complex. I'm saying they're subpar because they're just not that engaging. Now, it's obviously okay to like these segments and think they're fun or hype moments and all. I just think that the hardcore defenders of this game do exaggerate how good these segments are, at least in my personal opinion. I also don't think these segments are boring and janky segments that pad out the game like the detractors seem to think. They honestly don't go on for long enough to be an Arkham Knight kind of situation, where they're just a giant pace killer that stops the game's mechanical momentum to a grinding halt. There also aren't enough of them for me to completely dread their existence, but I personally would have been fine with both of these segments being relegated to maybe one chapter each. Probably would be cool with them if maybe they saved them for their last missions that they appeared in respectively. From what you may take away with this analysis is that the game doesn't really do too much better than Doom 2016 and Eternal, but that's not true, at least on 2016's part. I won't say 2016 did too much better than this game, but there are a lot of areas that I think Eternal specifically did better in, like the more complex combat and less scripted stuff. Thankfully, the idea of Eternal doing literally everything better isn't 100% true, because there's one aspect that I think this game does better than 2016 and, hell, even Eternal. and that is boss fights. Boss fights in 2016 were pretty decent, at least in my personal opinion, but I see a lot of split opinions on that too. I thought the Cyber Demon and the Hell Guards were really fun, and pretty satisfying to take down, but then the Spider Mastermind is really dull and underwhelming as far as capping off the game. Eternal isn't really much better as far as bosses go either, to be honest. The only major boss that I thought was close to as good as the first two bosses in 2016 was the Gladiator, and then the closest we ever get to that height of quality is the Con Maker, although I don't find her fight to be particularly the greatest either. Then the Icon of Sin happens, and he's pretty overrated in my book. Yeah, I know, kill me. The scale is massive, but the gameplay is just sort of fine. Yeah, I know, I should put my own head on a pike for making this take or whatever. Don't worry, because it's, the actual final boss of the DLC is... The point in mentioning all of this is to say that I think Dark Ages does its bosses considerably better in comparison to 2016 and Eternal. While yes, it still does have the Eternal issue of a few of the bosses being mini-bosses that become enemies later on, the major encounters with villains and larger creatures are a major highlight of the game. I still like those mini-bosses a bit, even if the big rig champion spews that poison gunk that's really frustrating to get out of. The first major bosses that aren't mini-bosses come about the home stretch of the campaign, just like the fights in 2016. You start off by fighting the Creed Maker, who is also a pretty good introductory main boss. I was initially somewhat disappointed by the simplicity of the fight, but then I realized that was only phase 1. Once the second phase starts after Creed starts taking off his clothes for some reason, the fight gets even crazier, and he starts finding more variations of projectiles. The best part about this is that with this game being more focused on a 3D bullet hell sort of direction, the Creed Maker especially takes advantage of this by throwing pretty much everything in the kitchen sink at once towards you in phase 2. But I also think that this fight would likely benefit from the ability to increase the gameplay speed, since some of these projectiles in the default setting are a bit slower moving. But that doesn't mean that they're at all easy to avoid 100% because shield stamina exists. The next boss after it is the one with the old one, which is the Cthulhu monster I talked about earlier when discussing the Atlan segments. While I don't particularly love the mech segments, I do think that this boss with the old one is pretty decent in context. Sure, the mechanics are bare, but the spectacle is what carries this fight in particular. I know I criticize the style over substance quality of these segments, but I think this one is engaging and fun enough to slightly get away with it. Then you have the fight with King Azrak, and for as bland as he is within the story on a narrative level, his fight is pretty fun and probably the hardest in the game. It's still not that hard, but it's considerably less easy compared to other encounters, and it was the first time I died in a major boss encounter at this point in the game. This is mostly because of the focus on parrying in the fight, which, for as cliche as this sounds, really reminded me of Genichiro Ashina from Sekiro or something. His attacks are so fast that the usually generous medium parry timing feels a bit more strict, which I think is nice. The form he takes in his second phase honestly looks worse and more stupid and goofy, but the mechanics are greatly expanded upon. Then the third phase focuses a bit more on that 3D bullet hell part of the game, just like the Creedmaker fight. And while I do think that this was the point where the fight was kind of overstaying its welcome a bit, it ends fairly soon after. I also do think that the fight does become pretty easy when you take down the pillars that contain health and armor, but they at least require some skill and multitasking to gain. This is a great penultimate fight, and it's not the end, shockingly. My favorite fight in the game is the final boss, mostly because it's a cool duo boss with the witch that feels like a better version of the Hell Guards in 2016. It's a really great juggling act with the same strong guy fast guy approach in 2016, but it's more refined and fun in this game. Fighting both these guys at the same time is a lot of fun, and it never feels like one goes inactive while you hammer away at the other one, despite them somewhat waiting turns as far as who's shielded and who's attacking you head on. Then you get to the final phase with Azrak after the witch dies, and a lot of people found this part underwhelming because Azrak is weaker than last time. I personally think it's a pretty genius way to end off the game in this context because you already basically drained him of this power in the last fight. Plus, I think it works way more as a victory lap than a bombastic final showdown like Eternal tried to do. I think it's pretty exemplary of what this game in its totality is, because while a lot of people expected it to be bigger despite there being signs that it wouldn't be in this case, it did the opposite and dialed back its scale, just a little bit. While people didn't like it too much, it did still do a pretty good job in being purposely underwhelming, which, no, is not the same as bad on purpose, because the fight is still good. I think of it like how in Final Fantasy XVI, spoilers for FF16 by the way, Ultimalius is the final boss of that game, but after every big particle effect heavy phase, he gets tired. I think a similar principle applies here, which is a cool choice on its part, especially since this is a prequel game, so it's kind of allowed to have this sort of ending. With all that said and done, I think Doom the Dark Ages gameplay is less of a downgrade from Doom Eternal, and more so just something different that still feels like Doom, which I know a lot of people will probably debate me on that, but I don't really care. Doom: The Dark Ages has been called many things online in the past few weeks this game has been out. Some people are saying it's literal perfection, some are saying it's a step back and too different, and some people think it's a new low and the biggest black sheep of the franchise since Doom 3. And while all these points are completely subjective and nobody was wrong for thinking this, even if the last one feels like a bit of an exaggeration, I don't agree with any of these notions at all because Dark Ages is still pretty great. Like I said earlier, I think that a lot of the disappointment that people had was more so because of the insane hype and expectations that Eternal catalyzed. Eternal was groundbreaking enough to make it into people's top 10 games ever made in some cases, even for those who didn't even know what Doom was. Since 2020, Eternal has been amongst some of my favorite games ever made too. And despite my hype for Dark Ages, I already knew that it wouldn't be able to top that level of quality, but that also didn't mean it couldn't still be a great game. Unfortunately, we live in this weird world of media discussion where to most people, the product in question is either absolute utter peak fiction or absolutely terrible. They may even call a product mid for some reason, but they use it as a synonym for bad, which is incredibly confusing, but that's just the way it is. And when you add that onto the fact that it was the next game in the series, you know that you've created some mighty high expectations, even if you didn't mean to in this case because you intentionally made the thing smaller in scope, and literally takes place before a fair amount of games in the series. While I don't think people should exactly keep their expectations intentionally low just because the last product was so good that the bar couldn't be set any higher in every case, I do think that in the case of a small-scale prequel game, the expectations were way too high. Sometimes when a developer strikes gold with something so hard that they have to try their absolute damnedest to top it, it doesn't always pan out greatly. I think that the game that this game could be more aptly compared to is Batman Arkham Origins. While Arkham Origins was more so a holdover slash appetizer for Arkham Knight, it was also a small-scale prequel that had a lot of ambitious and fun mechanics, along with things that it just did better, like the bosses. Doom Dark Ages is similar because while it's not as good as the second game in the modern series, it's still better than 2016 in the same way that I felt that Arkham Origins was a better game than Asylum but not as good as City. Even if Eternal is a remarkably and considerably better game, Dark Ages was still a frantic and fun romp, and even did a few things better than the other games. Were some mechanics and ideas a bit conflicting? Sure. But the game's weakest aspects were the least abundant. Plus, it's a game that focuses more on fun than trying really hard to have a cinematic or deep story, nor does it try to force in live service elements. Idsoft clearly wanted to make a tight, focused campaign, and so much so that they didn't force in a multiplayer, and I think they succeeded on that front. So with that in mind, sometimes the best kind of moving forward isn't going bigger, it's going different.